and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1. In this video, I will give my overall review of Season 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks as a whole. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for Star Trek Lower Decks. If you have not seen all of Season 1, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. So, Lower Decks is an interesting show. It seems like before the show came out, the anticipation for this show wasn't very high. It seems like most people were kind of like, yeah, alright, it's another Star Trek animated show, I'll give it a shot, whatever, I'll watch it. It's not like they were thinking it would suck, well, at least not in general. Of course, there's the haters that think everything modern Star Trek sucks, so I'm not even talking about them. But people in general were just like, yeah, whatever, just didn't think it would suck, they just weren't very excited about it. Me personally, I was excited about it because I watched some of the interviews with the showrunner and saying how he was such a Star Trek fan and this was just a love letter to Star Trek. I actually thought it would be really good, and it lived up to my expectations. It was a really good love letter to Star Trek. It used comedy well, and it had like a classic TNG feel to it, because you could tell, and I knew this would happen because with the interviews with the showrunner, because he was such a huge fan of Next Generation, I knew that that's the show that he would emulate a lot, and it really comes across. And the characters are really strong, actually, and you can tell that this is a love letter to Star Trek. Now, I think this is the best of the three modern Trek shows, Discovery, Picard, and this. Mainly because I think it comes together the best. Like, it's more smooth. Like, there are moments in Discovery and Picard, particularly Picard, that I think is better than anything that's in this show. For example, I think Riker's cameo in Picard was much, much better than his cameo here, even though it was good here too. It was just great in Picard. But overall, this season's better than Picard or either season of Discovery, because it's more smooth and it comes together better, because both Discovery and Picard, they had their issues. Discovery in particular, both seasons had a lot of behind the scenes production issues that really show, and sort of the pacing and how things work. So the seasons are really messy, and I think the same is kind of, I don't know if Picard had behind the scenes troubles, but it's also a very messy season that's poorly paced and a bit up and down with like some unnecessary plot points and some characters that go nowhere. Whereas Lower Decks, I think all the characters are as well defined as they need to be in order to fit the format of the show, and the through stories really work. Now, unlike Picard or Discovery, Lower Decks isn't necessarily serialized, but it's kind of serialized in the sense of ongoing character stories, which I'm fine with that, and in fact I think that's a really good form of serialization. Not every episode has to tell like a chapter in the story. You can have independent episodes that tell their own stories, but as long as you keep continuity of character and continuity of what's going on the ship. This is the problem with Voyager, is that I was fine with them having each episode be its own story, but they didn't keep continuity with the characters, and it would reset everything at the end of each episode, which really pissed me off. So Lower Decks doesn't do that, so it's fine. I really enjoy the format of it. And here's the thing, and this is just my speculation, is that one of the main reason why Lower Decks works better than those other modern Trek shows is because it seems to me, and this is again speculation, that it had less studio interference. Particularly, I think it's most noteworthy with Picard that I really got the feeling, again, I don't know this for a fact, I hadn't read or heard anything, but I really got the feeling from watching that show that the studio kept bumping in and saying, hey, you need to have this action sequence, you need to have this epic action sequence in the finale, you need to have more action here, hey, let's make this more exciting, let's put this action here, let's put this action here. And it really, like, interfered with, like, the character-based nature of that show, and I think it really kind of messed it up. And that's why, even though I did enjoy Star Trek Picard, it wasn't nearly as good as it could have been. Like, it had the potential to be, because of what I would deem, or what appears to me to be, studio interference. Whereas I never got that impression with Lower Decks. And so I kind of, again, this is pure speculation on my part, but I kind of feel it's similar to the dynamic you had in the late 90s with Voyager and Deep Space Nine. Now, this I pretty much do know as a fact because I've read a lot about interviews with people and heard a lot of commentary about it. And the deal with late 90s Trek, we had Voyager and Deep Space Nine airing at the same time, and Rick Berman and all of the executives were more interested in Voyager because Voyager was the one that was airing on UPN, their main network show. They kind of lost interest in Deep Space Nine and just let it do its own thing, which is why Deep Space Nine ended up being much better than Voyager, because Voyager suffered from too much studio interference. As I said, Rick Berman executives prevented any sort of continuity or serialized storytelling. They had, there must be a thread of the week in every episode. And you could tell that the show, like, the people who were writing the show were very creative, and they could have done great things with Voyager, and there was a lot of potential there, a lot of great acting and everything. But the studio interference kept bogging it down and making it, their attempts to make it more palatable to mainstream audiences really hurt the show. Whereas Deep Space Nine, they interfered a little bit, particularly with forcing them to do a Klingon storyline in season 4 and bring Worf in. But for the most part, they just let them do their own thing, particularly towards the end of the show when the show did the serialized storytelling with the Dominion War. They interfered a little bit because they wanted to do serialized storytelling for the whole season there, and they made them pull it back a bit to just 7 episodes here and then 10 episodes in season 7, but they still, for the most part, let them do their own thing. And that's why Deep Space Nine ended up being actually a much better show, particularly in that era, than Voyager. And I think you kind of had the same dynamic here. Where they weren't, it seems to me, and again, pure speculation, that Alex Kurtzman and the main studio and CBS and all of them weren't as invested in Lower Decks as they were in, say, Discovery or Picard. I think Lower Decks is more of, we got to have something, a Star Trek show to fill the space in between Discovery and Picard, so people will stay subscribed to CBS All Access. And they were thinking more of Discovery and Picard as the big draw that's going to draw people into CBS All Access, but Lower Decks is just there as a placeholder to keep them subscribed in between seasons. That's really the feel I got, and that's why I think Lower Decks is better, because it had less, the studio was less interested in it, and for the most part, it seems like they did, I think Michael McMahon is his name, they did pretty much say, Michael McMahon had this idea that he always wanted to do, because he did these other comedy podcasts for Star Trek in the past, and so he always wanted to do a Star Trek comedy show, so he went, somehow got an interview, because I think he knew people, he got an interview with Alex Kurtzman in the Hideout, and look, this is what I want to do, and they were like, sure, go ahead and do it. And they pretty much, I think, left it, and again, speculation, but it seems like they just let him do his thing. They let him, his own devices, this is what you want to do? Sure, sounds like a great idea. Why don't you go ahead and do it, so we have a placeholder in between Discovery and Picard. And so they just let him do his thing. And that's why I think it turned out way better, personally. Because, yeah, as I said, with Discovery and Picard, it seems like their desire, same thing with Voyager, their desire to make it appeal more to mass audiences, to draw people in, to always have to have a thread of the week, always have to have these epic action sequences. They actively interfere with the show and interfere with the pacing of the show and make the seasons feel a bit disjointed. Whereas with Lower Decks, it seems like they weren't pushing that. Because it does seem like the goal of CBS All Access is to have a new Star Trek episodes airing every week to week, year round. And so they need to have a lot of shows to fill up this quota. So it seems like they are going to they're going to greenlight a lot of ideas that they maybe hadn't greenlighted in the past, in order to have that constant stream, but only certain shows are they going to focus on it for being the main draw. And I think Discovery and Picard, particularly Picard, because that was a huge deal. They were bringing Jean-Luc Picard back, and Discovery was, of course, the first modern Trek show that started it. So they were focusing more on those. Whereas I think Lower Decks is and I think some of these other shows like Strange New Worlds actually might slip in a little bit, because that was sort of like the fans wanted this, okay, we'll give it to you. But that remains to be seen. But I think it's definitely the case with Lower Decks, because as I said, the excitement level for this show was not very high beforehand. And that's exactly why I was excited for it, because I knew that there would be less studio interference and that it would basically be a Star Trek fanboying out, which can be great. I mean, this is actually something that 90s Trek never really allowed before. The first time I think we've really seen this in canonized Star Trek was in season 4 of Enterprise, which is when Rick Berman had sort of been kicked off and the producers kind of gave up on Enterprise, and so they put Manny Koto in charge, who was just a Star Trek fanboy, and he fanboyed out, particularly with the Mirror Universe episode in the Mirror Darkly, which is a huge fanboy love letter to Star Trek, which is why it was great. And so that's pretty much what the season of Lower Decks is. They is constantly referencing Star Trek, is constantly paying homage to Star Trek. The amount of Easter eggs and references in each episode of Lower Decks is just overloaded. There's YouTubers are having a field day. The YouTubers that do their Easter egg. Oh, here's an Easter egg because you could do some Discovery and some Picard. But with Lower Decks, it's like a treasure trove, because it's kind of the point is to reference Star Trek. Now, here's the thing about what makes Lower Decks unique is not that it's animated, because we have had the animated series before in the 70s. What makes it unique is that it is specifically a comedy. It's the first canonized Star Trek show that is a comedy. Now, I think it's a fine line to walk. It's a little... Doing comedy is actually really complicated. When I studied filmmaking and script writing and just writing in general, everyone will tell you comedies is the hardest thing to write, which you wouldn't think, because you would think that drama or suspense or whatever, you have to have these complex plots with intricate characters and well-defined characters. But a lot of people say doing comedy is actually harder. And with this show in particular, I think it has a really fine tightrope to walk, because it is a canonized Star Trek show. It has been officially decreed that this show is a part of canon. It is happening in the Star Trek universe, but at the same time, it's a comedy that's parodying Star Trek. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate the difficulty involved in that dynamic, because if you have a show that's not taking place in the Star Trek universe, but is parodying Star Trek, like say the Orville, for example, or like Galaxy Quest, which I think is only loosely based on Star Trek, they're more free to mock and make fun of it and do whatever they want without having to worry about how will this fit into actually being Star Trek, because it's not Star Trek, so they're more free to like poke fun at tropes and stuff like that. But so with Lower Decks being Star Trek, it makes it a bit harder because they can't go too silly over the top, because then how can it actually be Star Trek? And I think not all audience members see it this way. I don't think it's just me, though. I would think it's a fair assessment. Some don't care how silly and over the top it is. They can be as silly as they want because maybe they don't see it as actually being Star Trek, or maybe they don't care. But me, I do care. And I think it is a fine line to walk. And I think for the most part, the show gets it right. The show does a really good job of walking that line. A couple times they do go a bit too over the top for me, which I don't appreciate. And I do give it a lot of leeway, because if this was a serious Star Trek show, of course, they wouldn't be constantly talking about, past episodes. And there's a lot of meta commentary in this show, which I appreciate, which wouldn't be if it was a serious Star Trek show. So there's a lot of leeway I do give the show because it's a comedy. But if it goes too far, then I think, okay, this is too silly, too over the top, doesn't work for me. Other people may see it differently. Other people may be like, oh, who cares? I don't care if it fits into Star Trek at all. I just think it's funny. Where for me, and there's one episode in particular I'm thinking of, if it is too over the top and doesn't make sense for a story perspective, then I don't think it's funny. I don't find it funny. I think the flaws actively interfere with the comedy, and I think it's stupid, not funny. But that's just me. That's just my perspective. But as I said, for the most part, I think the show actually does a really great job. There's only a couple of times where I think they falter a bit. But for the most part, I'm really impressed with how they managed to walk that line, which I actually think is really impressive. That they do manage to be a Star Trek show, but at the same time, sort of poke fun at Star Trek from a loving perspective, not from a, oh, this sucks perspective, but sort of making fun of tropes and parodying things. And actually, I think that's kind of when the show is at its best, is when it is outright parodying particular Star Trek tropes and making it clear that it's parodying, because there's some examples where I think they don't go far enough to make it clear they're parodying. Particularly with me, it was Badgie, which apparently I'm alone in not liking Badgie. Everyone loves Badgie and wants to see Badgie appear more, but I don't. I didn't like Badgie because I don't think they went far enough. Because they were making fun of the trope of holodecks killing people, but to me, they should have made it more clear and maybe went even more over the top to make it clear that they're making fun of this trope. Because the fact that I don't think they went far enough to make to make it clear they were making fun of the trope kind of puts them more in the territory of doing the trope rather than making fun of it, which I think is a fine line. And that part I think they failed because they went too much in just doing the same trope that's been done over and over again rather than mocking it. I think they could have. I mean, they are mocking it, obviously, by having a talking badge being like, hey, how can I help you? And then try to kill people. That's obviously mocking it, but not enough for me. And that's just my personal taste. I know apparently everyone and their mother disagrees with me and they love Badgie, but I had to resign myself to the fact that the Badgie's probably going to keep appearing because everyone loves him, and I really don't. I really don't. But that's just me. So anyway, so yeah, I think this season was really great, but I don't think it's the best. I think as much as I do stand by my statement that it was better than Picard Discovery, I do think it did have its own growing pains. I think it did take a couple episodes to get into it, and I think a lot of people who were unsure about the show, who just tuned in for the first 2 episodes and tuned out again because they're like, oh yeah, this show's a mess, it's too fast-paced, I don't know what they're doing. Like, they didn't give it a fair shot because I think that the show does take a couple episodes to really get going. Where it really hits its stride for me is episode 4. I think the first 3 episodes, it got slightly better with each episode, but when episode 4 hit, is when I think they really hit their stride. And it stumbled a bit later after that, but for the most part, it just kept getting better, and it really sort of got the hang of because it's a fine line to have that perfect mix of comedy and drama, or comedy and sci-fi drama in this case. Because there's my favorite animated show of all time, BoJack Horseman, I think hits that line between comedy and drama perfectly. Which, again, even in that show, I think sometimes it falters and goes too far one way or the other. But I think it has that if you have that sweet spot, the sort of where you can have over-the-top ridiculous comedy, but actually still have really strong character-based drama, then that really works. And I don't think this show maybe doesn't do as great of a job as BoJack Horseman, but it's only its first season. Again, give it some time. But it does do a really good job, better than a lot of shows. So I do give it a lot of credit, again, for that. Alright, so let me talk about some of these characters. We have our main character, Ensign Beckett Mariner, who apparently some people are off-put by her as being really annoying. This is a taste thing, of course, because I actually really like her character. I like this style of character where she's really over the top and silly and just like and very rambunctious and basically really apathetic and doesn't care. And I actually find that really refreshing in a Star Trek show, to have a character who's apathetic, who's not worried about promotion, who isn't like all about, oh, I'm all Starfleet. You kind of get sick of that, because all the Star Trek shows try to do that because they want to present, hey, this is the best of the best. These are the best that Starfleet has to offer. So of course they're going to take their job seriously, and of course they're going to want a promotion. Of course they're going to want to follow the rules, and of course they want to do everything right. So it's actually refreshing for me, and that's what's the great thing about the format of this show, Lower Decks, which focuses on junior officers and an insignificant ship that just does second contact. That's what allows them to have a character like this who's just fun and doesn't give a shit and actually really experienced. And sort of has that wisdom that comes from experience, even if it's not from particularly Starfleet training or whatever. Now, they don't always do this character perfectly. I think the issue with this character, and I hate to use this phrase, but it does work the best, is that sometimes she comes off too much like a Mary Sue. Particularly episode 2 was the biggest issue I had with this, where she knew everything and she was right about everything, and and I think that's an issue that wasn't there the whole time. I think mainly is part of the growing pains, as I said, of this character. I think later in the season they did a much better job of showing her as more nuanced and complex. That yes, she's experienced, yes, she does know a lot, but she also has her own flaws. And when they explored those flaws more is when I found her a lot more interesting. That she is still a wise character that the other junior officers should take note of. And again, I love her apathetic attitude. And I think they use it great in terms of comedy. I mean, it's just comedy gold in a lot of cases. But I like what I found even more interesting is the later episodes when they got into her issues, particularly the episode 9 when she was working on her therapeutic issues over her mother issues with having her mother be her captain, and how that really plays with her. Actually, there's a lot of episodes that episode 4 also played with this, and that's when I think this character's at her best, quite frankly. I think that's when the show's at its best, when it's showing the complexities of this character, so it becomes more than just a silly comedy. I mean, her character, as I said, is great for comedy, but it's also great for drama, and that's why I think it really works. There's a few instances where I think they got too much into, oh, she knows everything, can do no wrong, which did bother me. I think there's only 2 episodes I'm thinking of. But for the most part, yeah, I think this character really, really worked. Now, there's Bulmer, who is... Some people say that he's the main character. I would argue Mariner is the main character, and I don't know, they're both the main character, really. But Bulmer is a bit more one beat, where he is the ensign who wants to get promoted, which does, as I said, stick to the stereotype of the type of Starfleet officer we usually see in Star Trek shows. Your Harry Kims, or what's her name, Tilly from Discovery, and your Wesley Crusher or what have you. Your typical character who wants to toe the Starfleet line and do everything right. But I think his inclusion in this show does work really well, because he's a great counterbalance for Mariner. I think if you had Bulmer without Mariner, he wouldn't work. And you actually need Bulmer for Mariner to work as well. It's a great dynamic that they have, placing these two together as good friends who feed off each other. In fact, their character growth does work throughout the show. As I said, this had sort of serialized storytelling in terms of character growth, because it starts where Bulmer's really unsure about Mariner, and that he's kind of having to police her or whatever, but as the season goes on, he becomes they can become more in tune with each other. And I like how she constantly razzes him, but at the same time, you can tell that she also appreciates him for who he is. She just doesn't like to show it. One of my favorite scenes is when he does that whole sarcastic Vulcan salute, which is what he learned from Bulmer. I mean, he learned that from Mariner, and Mariner's just like, don't try to do that. You don't look cool doing that. And as soon as he leaves, she's like, yeah, damn it, he does look cool doing that. So it shows that they're learning from each other. It shows that Bulmer is learning from her to let loose a bit more. And it shows that she is actually learning to appreciate Bulmer more and say that actually, no, it does work for him. So I think they had a really good character dynamic. I think Bulmer on his own doesn't work very well, because he's another stereotype. But because they placed him in this situation on this ship, and they often put him in a lot of silly, over-the-top comedic situations, you need that. And I think it really strengthens the show overall. Now, you also have Tindy, who I still don't have a huge handle on this character. She seems a bit one beat as well, where she's just excited by everything, that she's happy to be here, and all the things that a lot of people would find tedious about Starfleet or working on the ship, she loves, and she's all about it. And it seems like they use the same joke with her over and over again, where it seems like there's something someone else would be appalled at or think is stupid or ridiculous, but she finds it exciting. She's like, oh my God! It's like she starts off by saying, what? You did this? And makes you think that she's going to be appalled or whatever, but instead she's like, oh my God, that's amazing! And sometimes she's used very well, particularly in episode 8 when they have her storyline where they mistake her for the cleaner. Like that, I think, is the best use of her character, where she really worked in that situation. But for the most part, she is kind of one beat. And I'm not saying she's a bad character, but I'm saying she needs more development. They need to get into her more and flesh her out more in the coming seasons, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with having that in the first season, because it's only one season, it's only 10 episodes. You need more time, and she's not the main character, so that's fine. You need a bit more time to flesh her out a bit more. Rutherford is very similar to Tindy in being excited by everything, but I think he has a little bit more going on, particularly his cybernetic implant, and also he has this sort of chipper attitude where he doesn't really stand up for himself, and then he just goes along. Particularly, one of my favorite storylines with him was in episode 2, where he wanted to hang out with Tindy more. In order to do so, he found that he couldn't be in engineering anymore, so he looked for another career just so he could hang out with her, which is silly, but it's a comedy, so it works, and also it makes him an endearing character. And also, like, seeing him try all these different jobs was hilarious, particularly when he was trying to be a medical officer and he sucked at bedside manner. It was one of the funniest jokes in the whole show, where this guy was burned. He was trying to give him bedside manner. He was like, "You got plasma burns? Oh my God, how are you still alive?" And I think, they used his implant as a unique character trait, which I think worked, particularly when in a more recent episode when he was trapped in the different modes and had to switch it constantly, or when it kept rebooting, which was a nice sort of computer joke, and he kept finding himself in weird situations. So I think this character worked a little better for me. I still think he does need to be fleshed out a bit more as well. But I think I liked it. Now, this is something I talked about earlier in this season, is that for the first part of the season, they relied way too much on the format of, we'll have an A plot and a B plot, and the A plot will have Bulmer and Mariner doing something, and the B plot will have Tindy and Rutherford doing something. And that was getting really tiresome. If you watch my week-to-week review, I kept complaining about that. Later in the season, they did start moving away from that, which I really liked, and I hope they continue to move totally away from that, because I think these characters work a lot better together. Or if you mix and match them and don't always have the same pairing, but I think they work the best when all 4 of them are together and involved with each other. And I wanted to see more of that. I think it's a great ensemble. Yeah, so that was interesting. Now, as far as the senior officers go, I'm not going to get into each one individually because they weren't as fleshed out, because they weren't the point of the show. I think it's another situation where I thought earlier season they didn't really know how to fit the senior officers into a show that's all about the junior officers, because this is, again, what's unique about the shows compared to other Star Trek shows. Has every other Star Trek show is focused on the senior officers, and this is the first one that didn't. And I think they had a bit of a struggle with this at first to try to figure out this format of, okay, we have senior officers, but how do we use them if we're not focusing on them? And a lot of times, at first, I think it was a bit contrived to me how the junior officers, who are the main focus on the show, kept like interacting with the senior officers, because I thought the whole point is that they're lower decks, yet when they interact with the senior officers that much, then they not really are junior officers. They're more like senior officers now, like Harry Kim. He's an ensign, but he was still part of the senior staff. And so when you have Bulmer and Mariner constantly doing main missions with the senior officers, then they kind of become senior officers, and that kind of undermines the whole point of the show, is that it's not focused on senior officers. But I think this show did get better at this. I think they got better at integrating the senior officers into the main plots of the show without it feeling like the junior officers were also senior officers. And of course, Mariner and the Captain Freeman have a close bond because they're mother and daughter. So that gives them some leeway of why this ensign would be interacting with the senior staff so much, because it's her daughter. And I like how they used that storyline towards the end of the season when it was revealed and everyone was sucking up to her, which was funny and what really worked. Now, I don't think any of these senior officers were particularly fleshed out, but I don't think they needed to be, because, again, that's not the point of the show. They're not the focus. So the fact that Ransom was your stereotypical handsome man, Kirk/Riker stereotype, was fine, because that's the purpose he served. And the fact that the cat doctor was just your stereotypical grumpy McCoy/Pulaski, doctor is fine because that's the purpose that she serves, and the fact that Shax was your stereotypical let's destroy things security officer, fine, because that's the purpose he served. In fact, with Shax, I think it was more than fine. I actually loved how they played off of that stereotype, and I thought they did it to great comedic effect. The way they was like, "Come on, let me destroy things," because it was over-exaggerated version of Worf and what a lot of fans would joke that Worf would be like, and other sort of tactical security officers. And so to see them actually do that and do an over-the-top version was great. And really satisfying from a comedic perspective. And Captain Freeman, they did flesh out a bit because she is the captain, so that's fair, and mainly because of her relationship with being Mariner's mother. Now, I gotta admit, when I saw the first episode and they made the reveal that Freeman was Mariner's mother, I hated it. I said it was awful. It reminded me of the Orville where the captain and first officer were, used to be married, were ex-wife and ex-husband, which I still think is dumb, by the way. So it reminded me of that, and I didn't like it. But it grew on me. I think towards the end of the season, they actually made it work, and it actually helped flesh out both of these characters more and the interesting dynamic between them. So I actually did learn to appreciate that. Now, I want to talk about my two least favorite episodes of the season and my two favorite episodes of the season. So let me start with my least favorite. So let me get into my second least favorite episode of the season. Was Cupid's Errant Arrow, which is episode 5, where they introduce Bulmer's girlfriend, which some of this episode I liked. They had a side plot with Rutherford and Tindy, and this is when the Rutherford and Tindy side plots were getting really tiresome. And this one in particular about them wanting this transfer, but the guy was only trying to transfer them because he wanted to transfer out or whatever. Like, I really didn't like that storyline. But the main issue I had with this episode is the main storyline with Bulmer's girlfriend is because this is when I think was one of the worst uses of Mariner. This was like a really missed opportunity. This is when she came off as too much of a Mary Sue, because she had this storyline throughout the episode where she was constantly like paranoid that Bulmer's girlfriend was fake, was a hologram, was a shapeshifter, and she had all these over-the-top theories, which was hilarious. I liked it, but I think they ruined it at the end by making her be right. I think that storyline and her character would have been much, much better if she was wrong, because it would have showed that she was flawed. It would have showed that even though she had this greater experience, she also had greater baggage and more PTSD, which would actually interfere with her judgment a bit. And I think that would have made her more complex, more interesting character, and that would have made the comedy work better as well. The fact that there was a parasite in Bulmer, and first of all, that makes no fucking sense, because why wouldn't every woman, including Mariner, fall in love with him if the whole thing was the parasite made him more attractive to women? So, again, I'm not willing to say, well, it's a comedy, who cares? No, fuck that. That's a logical flaw. It hurts the comedy. It's not funny when that doesn't make any sense. And also, it hurts her character. It makes her too much of a Mary Sue, that she's always right all the time. It would have been way more interesting had she been wrong. And plus, it makes Bulmer the stereotypical pathetic character, does nothing for his character as well. I just really didn't like that. But the episode, so that's my second least favorite, almost my least favorite, but the episode I'm going to have to say is my least favorite is the Much Ado About Bulmer, which was episode 7. As I said, the later half of the season got better, but this was the exception to that. Because this, to me, was the episode that was written the worst, where it's the problem with the first two episodes, the problem with the early seasons, is that the pacing was too fast. Too many things happened. It was too manic of a show. And I think that this showed up the most in this episode, particularly with the storyline. So the storyline with Mariner, where she meets up with an old friend who's a captain and makes her her first officer, as she jellicos. I love the references to Jellico, though. How she takes over the Cerritos temporarily. But the problem with this storyline is it's just repeating the same storyline that was done earlier in the season, where Mariner becomes a senior officer and she hates it and she constantly tries to not be a senior officer because she doesn't want to be one. That's just beating a dead horse. And this is kind of something they need to work on with Mariner in season 2. And it does seem like where they left it at the end of season 1 that they will, because they have a different dynamic with her and the captain. But for this season, they're kind of hitting the same beats over and over again. She hates being a senior officer. She wants to be a junior officer. We get it. Like, this episode does nothing new about it. Just beats a dead horse and reestablish that. And plus the story with the other ship being in danger and like by this space squid or whatever, it happened so damn fast. It was so underdeveloped. It was just really poor writing. And the other storyline was also, I really didn't like it as well, with Bulmer and Tindy with her dog. I didn't care about this dog. I didn't find it funny. I thought it was stupid. And then the whole concept of Bulmer being like this transparent transporter and they just giving up on him and sending him to this like dungeon that actually turns out to be a resort, which is a stupid reveal, where all the freaks go. Which is so, again, this is where I think the show failed to be Star Trek and was relying too much on your stereotypical. This felt more like a cartoon comedy episode I've seen dozens of times before in other shows, and less like a unique Star Trek episode. And is less in tune with Star Trek, because it doesn't make sense to me that they would just cart off all these people with issues rather than trying to save them. Because, as I mentioned, in Star Trek, when something like this happened, like when Barclay was having a transporter thing, they didn't just abandon him and ship him out to this place. They kept working, trying to figure out exactly what was going on with him. And here, they didn't even try. Like, the cat doctor didn't even try to fix him. He's like, oh, well, nothing I can do. Bye. Like, that's bullshit. That doesn't fit in Star Trek. It doesn't work. And they do it in order to have this stereotypical, really not funny, cliche, boring storyline about, ooh, look at all the freaks trying to take over the ship and all of this guy's creepy, but it turns out he was right all along. Like, really didn't appreciate that. So to me, this was the clear worst episode of the season. But let me get into what I think are the two best episodes of the season, where the show really worked for me. The second best episode of the season, in my opinion, was Moist Vessel. Episode 4, as I said, this is where the show really started to come together. They had the main storyline of this is when the Mariner and Captain Freeman relationship really started working for me. So this is when Freeman had a problem with Mariner, didn't know what to do with her, wanted her to transfer off the ship, so that they gave her all the shittiest jobs, but she actually had fun with it. And again, this showed with the type of character she is, that she just doesn't give a shit and she can make light of anything. And so then they realized the worst fate would be to promote her and make her a senior officer. And I love the irony of that, how that's Bulmer's ultimate goal, but it makes Mariner miserable. And I love seeing that dynamic they play off. And I think the jokes really work with this, particularly like the poker game when it was like, I fold, and then Ransom sitting there going, I fold. Like, and then Mariner's finally like, you fold, everyone folds, and she starts freaking out. Like, that was hilarious. And then you get into the main thrust of the episode. And again, this, to me, unlike episodes like much ado about Bumler or the first two episodes that were just too manic and too fastly paced and didn't give you a chance to get a hold of it. Like, I thought this episode was perfectly paced, where it was, it felt natural. It felt like a Star Trek episode. It felt like this is something we would see on Star Trek, with the it develops it really good from the start of the episode with the two ships like escorting this, terraforming type vessel, and then something goes wrong, and the Cerritos starts to get terraformed and it becomes into a swamp, which is, again, it's taking great advantage of the animation because this is something they could never afford to show in real life. Because the budget would be too high, and so I love that. And I think, and again, they use this opportunity to develop the Mariner and Freeman relationship more, and how they have to work together to get it. It made sense. It worked for the storyline, and I just think it was one of the best uses of these characters in this show. And this is when I really started to appreciate the show. I think this is the episode where the show really started to come on its own and come together. And then there's a side plot which apparently is really polarizing. The side plot about Tindy helping this guy ascend, because I heard this opinion that absolutely despised this storyline, thought it was awful, and I heard another opinion that loved this storyline, thought it was the best thing ever. Where I don't think it's the best thing ever, but I lean more towards that. Where I like this storyline. I thought it really worked for me. I thought it was funny. I actually think this is one of the better uses of Tindy, because it actually showed a flaw in her character. It showed how, and this made sense, that she was the type of character who can't stand to have someone hate her. It's kind of a cliche plot I've seen before in other sitcoms, but I think it works. And I like the whole reveal about how the guy was lying about ascending because he wanted that to be his thing, and then him and Tindy connect, and that actually leads to him ascending, which was a hilarious scene. So I don't know how anyone. I really am puzzled how anyone can hate the storyline. I loved it. But then, of course, I gotta mention, it has one of the funniest jokes, one of the jokes that I thought was the best, at the end of the episode, when the Admiral came in and said "censors," and that's when Mariner, of course, started acting up again and got demoted because she was like, "Censors? What?" Because it's such a Star Trek thing where people say censors, but nobody calls them out on it. And this is what I love about the show. It's what makes it unique, that we have a character who's a surrogate for the audience who will be like, "Wait a second, he's saying censors," and then Freeman's getting really pissed off. She's like, "Oh, Mariner, you better stop. I don't have any problem with that." And she's like, "Well, maybe you need to adjust your sensors." Like, I lost my shit at that. I thought that was hilarious. Anyway, we'll get into my favorite episode of the season, and that is episode 9, Crisis Point. This, I think, was the best parody, and it was the best comedy. Like, I was laughing hysterically throughout this episode, but at the same time, it was the best character story as well. As I mentioned this earlier, how this really is where they dove deep into Mariner's character, and I like how it started with her seeing the therapist, which was Mr. Peanut Butters. I'm sorry, I cannot help but hear Mr. Peanut Butters as this therapist who kept talking about food, which I thought was a funny sort of gag to have. But that didn't really work with her, that her going on the holodeck, that was a better therapy, and her like just letting out her frustrations and killing all the senior officers. Like, some people thought that she was going too far by doing this, but I don't, because it's a holodeck. It's a fantasy. She's not actually killing these people. It's just like, similar to someone who like punches a pillow or throws dart and puts someone's picture up or something. It's just letting out her frustration. But by doing so, she encounters the truer version of herself that realizes that this part of her, the angst part, is unjustified, and how she is actually literally fighting herself, is what leads her to to become peace, and get over this thing. And I loved it. I thought it was a great character story. But the comedy where it was really parodying movies, and that was kind of the whole point, was brilliant. I think this is probably some of the best referential jokes where they were making fun of the movies and how they were over the top, and like they had the scene where they were just flying around the ship forever. To me, I know they did that in several Star Trek movies, but to me that's picture perfect, the motion picture, because the motion picture had literally 11-minute sequence of them doing that, and you're like, oh my god, stop, it's too much. And I like how they just start going in circles and whatnot. It was hilarious. And they had other movie tropes like the lens flares and the over-the-top villains who's very stereotypical, who just wants revenge. And they also had interesting character beats for Tindy. Probably my favorite character beat for her in the whole episode, where they actually bring up the fact that she's Orion and how people stereotype them as pirates when she's not a pirate at all. And it's kind of making fun of the whole Star Trek trope of how they constantly say this species only has one trait, and everyone of that species has that trait. And they call that out in this episode. So that worked. The Rutherford stuff was a bit predictable, where he was sucking up to his engineer, but that also worked for great comedy. Again, making fun of movies where he beams everyone out, and the engineer is like, oh, how you can't, that doesn't make sense. And he's like, oh, this is the movie, you can do anything with transporters, which is a nice jab at all the shit they do with transporters in movies. So I absolutely loved that episode. That really worked for me as well. And I like Bulmer's sort of inclusion in this episode, where he kept trying to suck up to the captain. At the end, found out it was Mariner was a daughter, and just totally blew the interview because of that. And the other thing I absolutely loved about this episode is that it was a holodeck episode, yet there was no trapped in the holodeck. There's no threat of the week. And this is exactly what I was talking about earlier with Voyager, where it felt like, and this is a problem with pretty much all Star Trek, but Voyager was the worst, where there has to be a threat of the week. You can't just have a character story. You can't just have characters hanging out. If they go in the holodeck, something has to try to kill them, because you need to have a threat of the week. And I actually talked about this in the episode of Fistful of Data's Next Generation, how that actually could have been a good episode had they just ditched the whole the threat of the week. Actually actively ruined that episode. And this episode would have been ruined too had they done a threat of the week. But there was no threat. Nothing went wrong. The holodeck safeties were fine. But instead, they used this holodeck program. We got to see it play out exactly how it should have. Mariner wanted it to be a movie, a Star Trek movie, and it was. And it worked for the character. Like, you don't need a threat. You can develop the characters where she finds out that she is being too hard on her mother, and that she needs to learn to work to her. Like, that worked. That was a great character story. When people go on the holodeck, things don't need to go wrong. I love that. That's another thing I just think that this show just nailed. It was great. And having Da Vinci just show up at the end randomly and shoot the villain, not on my watch. I'm like, that is great comedy. Great comedy. So, yeah, that was my favorite episode of the season. Anyway, my rating for Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1 out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. Didn't quite reach 9-ness to me. It's very close. So I would say this is a high 8. I don't do 0.5s or whatever. But I would say this is in the high 8 because didn't quite reach 9 because it had a rough start. It had some, and then it's kind of had a relapse with episode 7, Much Ado About Bullimore, which is just a disaster in my opinion. Where it regressed and repeated the same thing over again, but it had a rough start with not finding the right niche for this show, or how to use the senior officers correctly, and having the pacing was too fast. But I think they really came into its own with episode 4, and particularly towards the end of the season with the last 3 episodes, it really showed like the showrunners and the writers and everyone knew what they were doing. They knew how to tell these great, hilarious end jokes about Star Trek, while having great character stories at the same time and interesting drama. And I think that's a hard line to walk, and I think the show was very impressive for, especially towards the end, coming together and able to do that in a really great way. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is how this show, as I said, I talked about at the start how it was sort of a fanboy show, which can be off-putting towards some people who are not familiar with Star Trek, which is probably why this is more of a placeholder, because it's not meant to appeal to the mass public, and I think that's why it works. I think there's nothing wrong with having a show with that, which is part of the reason why some people are really against Alex Kurtzman and Modern Trek and hate CBS All Access and everything it stands for, but I actually like the fact that they're pumping out a whole bunch of Star Trek shows. And here's why, and this is what I mentioned before when they first announced the concept of that they were going to keep punching out a shitload of Star Trek shows. A lot of people were against this because they feel like people are going to get overloaded with too much Star Trek, and it's just going to become tedious, which I don't know. For me as a Star Trek fan, that was never an issue for me. But why I like this idea and actually think it's going to work, because it allows them to fill different niches. And this is the first show that really illustrates that, because it has a totally different niche of applying comedy specifically geared towards Star Trek fans, particularly geared towards those who are interested in Star Trek, who get all these references, who appreciate all these references, particularly when they're used well. In the start of the season, they weren't used that well. They just threw out names and characters, where towards the end of the season, it was used a bit more cleverly, like the whole Landrew thing. Landrew, apologize, and stuff like that. And the cues used like, oh, I'm going to test humanity. Like, those references were used a bit more cleverly and were more funny. But even if you don't know anything about Star Trek, you could still like the show. You could still find it funny. You could still appreciate it. But I think you appreciate it a lot more if you do know more about it, because you get more jokes, you get more references. And I like that. And I think that's great. But I think you would never have a show like this. Like, if there was just doing one Star Trek show at a time, or even 2 Star Trek shows at a time, you would never get a show like this, because they would need to have those shows appeal to mass audiences. They couldn't have them be this alienating towards mass audiences. But because they're doing this format where they're trying to fill all these different niches, and they have a whole bunch of different Star Trek shows that fill different niches, I think that's a great idea, because this show could apply to that people more, and they're coming out with a Nickelodeon show that would apply more to young audiences, and they'll have like the Pike show will apply more to people who like the original thing. I think so far, before we got Lower Decks, the issue was the 2 shows they had were maybe a bit too similar in tone, Discovery and Picard. So I think they need to diversify more, because both Discovery and Picard were trying to be epic and have these epic and serialized storytelling, which has the fate-ending world-ending stakes or whatever, where they were different, because one was set in Next Generation times and featured Next Generation character Picard, and the other was a prequel to the original series. But they were only different in setting, in tone, and style. They were too similar. And this show was totally different, not just in setting, but in tone, style, completely out of left field, totally different from Picard. And this is what they need to do more. They need to find different niches, make the shows different, have some be like, and this is what they're doing with Strange New Worlds, because that's going to be episodic, so that's going to appeal more. I don't like these serialized storytelling. Fine, we'll have this show for you that's more episodic. But some people are like, but I do love serialized storytelling. Okay, that's fine. We'll have these other shows. Like, that's what I love, this concept. So I'm not going to be oversaturated or get sick of Star Trek if they have tons of Star Trek shows, as long as they diversify, as long as each show is completely different and fills a different niche, applies to different people, which means some show will be more alienating to others, because, like, I know some people who hate animated comedies. They're refusing to watch the show, which is fine, because it's not for them. They appreciate Discovery more. Fine, Discovery's for you. But other people hate Discovery because it's trying to be too epic and they use curse words or whatever. Okay, fine, Lower Decks is more for you because it has that more Next Generation feel to it. I think that's perfect. I think that's exactly what they need to do. So yeah, overall, I think Lower Decks bodes well for the Star Trek universe, for the CBS All Access format that they're going for. It makes me think a lot better of it. It makes me more hopeful for the future. And I'm really hopeful for the future of this show. I think it has a lot of potential. I think each season is probably going to get better and better. There's a lot of people already who are calling this the best first season ever of any Star Trek show. I'm still a sucker for Voyager, and I think the original series also was a bit better. But I would actually put this third behind those two, which is a good accomplishment. I think it's better than even Picard, and Discovery, as I said, is better than Next Generation's first season, which sucked. Enterprise first season was god-awful. Deep Space Nine's first season was decent. Not as good as the rest of the show, but it did have Duet in it. But I still would put this ahead of it. So yeah, I think this was not perfect, as I said, which is why I gave it an 8. But I think this was a very good adding. And I think this was the best of modern Star Trek so far. And I think it bodes well for modern Star Trek. And they just need to keep doing what they're doing here. Diversify. Have each show have a totally different tone, totally different style. And so some people gravitate more to some shows than others, which is fine. But I'm actually really excited at the prospect of having Star Trek year-round, week-to-week, no matter. And one show ends, another show begins, which is what we're getting here with Lower Decks ending and Discovery beginning. Although they don't have enough shows going at the moment, so there probably will be a gap after Season 3 of Discovery ends, which is fine. But if we ever get to the point where there isn't a gap and it's constantly Star Trek on, I'm going to be a happy camper. I just am. Even if I don't like some shows and I appreciate some shows more than others, I'm still looking forward to that day. But that's just me. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek Lower Decks Season 1. Thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to check out my coverage of Star Trek Discovery, as I will be covering that as that airs week to week. And I also cover many other Star Trek shows, as well as other shows like The Expanse, BoJack Horseman, Breaking Bad, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.